I'm delighted to be here today with Paul Gordon Collier. And many of you may remember that Paul gave us a lot of his background and his life story about 2 weeks ago. And I will put a link to that in the description so that if you want to know more about Paul, you can see that. But we want to accomplish two things today. Paul, you had mentioned that there was something left that you still wanted to say about your
One big
life.
hole I missed.
One
Yeah,
big hole that you missed
totally.
last year.
Yeah.
And then you also have a project that you call Apex Existentialism, and we want to discuss that today and see what your project consists of and where you're headed on it, and just kind of explore it a little bit.
All right.
Okay. So
So,
let's start with filling that hole that got missed the last time that we talked.
so if anybody watched the last video, if he didn't, oh gosh, really, go watch that video
Missed a
already.
lot,
No,
yeah.
I missed a lot. But in the beginning, I described how I was born where my mother had a C-section, and I was lined up in the birth canal first. Took my brother, so he ends up being the firstborn. Well, the reason why why that was so significant, when I was about 11 years old, we finally met my dad's side of the family, the Weidenhoffs. And when we met them, they relayed a prophecy to my brother. And the prophecy was the fourth William will change the world and will meet world leaders and change the world. The fourth William being William Jacob Weidenhoff the fourth. Now, my brother is William Raymond Collier Jr., but we are blood. We are actually Weidenhoffs. My grandfather Collier adopted my dad, and so so that was the key thing. That what that did for me was that really created this whole Jacob Esau kind of mythology in my head. Well, in a twisted, in a twisted way, in which I was Esau, except I didn't trade my inheritance for a bowl of soup. It was just literally taken from me by chance circumstance. I don't have that mindset anymore, but that really that at that point, that's what took me out of Christianity. So at that point, because this was a Christian, this was a Christian revelation, and the prophecy, I don't know, I can't say necessarily that it's changed, that it's come true. I don't know if my brother has changed the world, but he has met with world leaders, and he has met with quite a few, and he's influenced. And he wrote a book recently called The Capitalist Manifesto with Ralph Benko, who was a former financial advisor, or he was on Reagan's in Reagan's administration, and that book got rave reviews from the likes of Steve Forbes and others. So it's he in a sense he is kind of changing the world. So yeah, that was the last element, the last part. That's what took me out of Christianity in the first place. I can't believe I forgot that part. That was pretty big.
So that's interesting. Why did that cause you to reject Christianity?
Well, because I was reduced. I was the Esau. In my mind, I was the Esau. I was the unloved one. When Paul says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And I didn't like that God.
Oh,
You know,
yeah. I
now I view myself still as well. I'm not Esau, and my brother's, he's 2 minutes older than me, and don't you forget it, because he won't let you forget. But I'm now the way that I view things now. My brother and I are working on, and one day maybe you could think about possibly having a talk with him about Eupaderia. And Eupaderia is a project that we're working on, which is we're basically trying to create a Christian nation. Nothing too dramatic. We believe we're ushering, well, not well, yeah, we kind of believe we're ushering in a new civilization, a Christian civilization that is, well, it's not one formed with guns. It's formed with, well, Christian association, Christians that are actually building civilization together. But anyway, that's a long story in and of itself. So I want to be viewed now as the Esau that showed up without a bunch of men and said, "Hey, let my guys go with you." And Jacob's like, "No, no, 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 I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. I'm good." I want to be the Esau that Jacob meets and is happy to see, and Esau is happy to meet Jacob. So in a way, I'm hoping to be that. Whether if I am as a prophet, I don't know whether. I mean, the prophecy has meat to me because I've seen things happen with my brother, just extraordinary things. My brother had a situation recently where his wife is suffering from dementia, and she was really going down really bad. It looked like she's going to die soon kind of situation. And he had to take her to the hospital. And so this just happened recently. And the bill in the end was 90 plus $1,000. And for some reason that he can't even explain, the hospital called him and they have some program, whatever, and they forgave the whole debt.
Wow.
Just, yeah. And these kind of things happen to my brother all the time. So I feel like there may be something true to this prophecy. And I want to embrace it and not be, not be Esau, not be Cain either, even,
Mhm.
if I could be the Cain that, first off, the Cain did not give the first fruit. I want to point that out. This is why I believe Cain was not blessed, because Cain did not give the first fruit. It pointed out Abel gave the first fruit. It just said Cain, he gave a sacrifice, but he didn't give the first fruit. And he didn't, because he was a bitter man holding on to everything. And I in a lot of ways that's what I was for most of my life until I met my wife, and then it changed. And it just seems very poetic to me. I was born in Polyclinic Hospital, and circumstances in which my brother gets the quote unquote inheritance. But the Polyclinic Hospital is where I met my wife, and then that was a rebirth for me in and of itself. So I was born twice in a sense in the Polyclinic Hospital. See, it all ties together.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's it. That was my hole I wanted to make sure I filled. So
Well,
now we can
and
you
yeah,
you have
I want to just say one thing about that, and it ties back to art. One of the things that a lot of that I struggled with when I first started painting is that I would look at somebody else's work and I would think, oh, I wish I could paint like that, or oh, I wish I could
hmm
paint like that. Always looking at somebody else's thing and wishing that that could be mine. And then one day my teacher said something so interesting. And of course, she's using worldly language, but she said, everybody has their own magic, Karen. Everybody has their own magic.
yeah.
So I'm maybe not crazy about the word magic, but there is something there, that there is something unique and precious about every person's life and experience. And so whoever your brother is, you, Paul, you have your own magic too, and you have your own
Right.
massive contribution to make to the world. So
Yeah, and that's I actually went through that process, which I didn't use that language, but
yeah.
maybe about 7-8 years ago is when I really. I mean, I've been at peace with this whole thing for a while. The only reason I brought it because I think it's relevant to. It's another example of how I have been taken out of all of the frames of all the normal frames out there, and I believe that is why, if I'm right about Apex Existentialism, that is why I might have something unique. And I don't know that I do, but I think I might. And I'll say that I use Apex Existentialism in my news analysis. If you go to freedomist.com, that's where I do my stuff. And I use it to forecast. It's a very good forecast. It helps me understand because it forces you to think in terms of what I call the reality of power instead of ideas. Now I'm I'm not looking for meaning in relationships. Oh, I mean I am, but I mean when I'm analyzing, I'm not looking for the meaning that the relationships are espousing. I'm looking for the underlying reality of power. If I could figure out someone's apex existentiality, I can then map out what their next move might be. So, and I just found it to be, it's not like I'm the amazing Kreskin with it, but it has put me in good stead in understanding in large part what might be. I knew, and I know a lot of people probably saw what is going on now as something that would happen maybe 10 years ago. They were already looking at it 10, 15 years ago, but so was I. And I didn't have apex existentialism formed as a word or even understood what it was that I was processing. But for a long time, I've used this type of tool to analyze why people do what they do. And the fundamental question that I always ask is that I've been obsessed with since I was a kid is why do humans act? And that is really what this is all about. It's all about figuring out why humans act, although I don't think you'll ever get the answer. But in pursuing the question, the closer you get to that, the closer you get to authentically understand what humans are doing and why they're doing it.
Okay, well, so that gives us a good place to start, because I think for me, you sent me an analysis or kind of a breakdown of the idea in general. And there were many terms that you were using in a way that I'm sure is unique to you, because I had a hard time processing exactly what you meant by them. So let's start with those terms and
Okay.
help me to understand what's inside your head. And then we can begin to explore the idea in general. But
Okay.
maybe as a first overarching question, um, you obviously differentiate apex existentiality from the philosophy of existentialism.
Yes.
Okay, and which means
Although
that you
there's
must have seen something lacking in existentialism that you wanted to address.
no,
Or are you
I
using the word
I end up
existential
I
in
use the
a way?
phrase just because I'm existentialism is just describing the way that I'm using the term. It's essentially existentialism is the types of being that you can experience, and I have three planes of existentiality, which are ideational, genetic, and physiological. So the existentialism part is, in essence, it is, I don't want to say the real, but it is the underlying reality of power,
Okay,
whereas the
let's
apex,
not go too far with
sorry,
this power
sorry,
word, because I haven't
sorry,
gotten to power yet.
okay,
So let me just go back to the three aspects or the three types of being that you can
three
experience,
planes of existentiality.
the three planes, um, because that made me start to think that maybe you and I have at least one frame of reference that's similar. So let me tell you my frame of reference and then tell me if it's
Okay.
getting at what you're talking about. Many years ago, I started to think about why communication is so complicated. And I realized that as a person, I am made up of my entire I am made up of my genetic background, and I am also made up of my entire physical experience, everything that I've ever experienced, and every idea that I've ever heard, and every idea that I've ever generated myself, and every song I've heard, and every poem I've heard and read, and those things, each one of them gets filtered through the what's already existing in this framework that is who I am, and then it gets filtered through there and adds to it, and all of these things build up in my life, so that who I am is this ideational, genetic, and physiological being that is filled with all of these experiences. Now, is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Well, it's not really what I'm talking about, but it is. It fits well. It fits nicely. It totally fits. You're describing uh, the amalgamation of your perceptions, I guess, is what you're describing. Am I correct in saying that? This
Well,
is
it's
this the
it's the
source of your perception?
it's the amalgamation of my, let's say, my the unique framework through which I interpret everything that I perceive and everything that I hear, and the
Yeah.
unique framework through which, when I speak, it's as I process in my brain, as the words come out, it's coming out through that filter. So when I hear
This
you say
this
something,
totally lines up. Yes,
yeah, when
totally
I hear
lines up.
you say
Yes.
something, it goes through this filter in me, and by the time it gets down to my insides, it's going to be different than it was when you said it. So there's
Right.
something happening between us that allows us somehow to communicate, and at the same time, there's no question that we're not truly understanding each other because our own perceptual frameworks are so unique.
Yes, and if I want to be pragmatic, there is a sufficient overlap for us to be able to understand enough. and even if we don't understand enough, as long as we're functioning,
Yeah,
then something's happening, and
yeah.
that might be the best that we can do. But for me, these three planes of existentiality, they definitely influence the way that you perceive, but they're also, these are the parts of you that are pursuing being, and the being that you're pursuing is, you want to perceive that you are the height of whatever being it is that you're perceiving or that you're pursuing. And so the ideational is the will to have your ideas seen and lived out in others, and to have a sense that they are doing so consensually. And that's a big element. That's part of the apex existentiality as I'm working it out, is you have to have this perception that the other that you want to have live out your ideas has done so consensually. Because if you have to take, well, this is where it's hard, because now I'm going to say other words. If you have to be coercive or cooperative, and see, I don't look at cooperation in a very good way. It's a bad word for me. Um, my three exchanges of value are coercive, cooperative, and consensual. And cooperative is when one or the other party is in a significant power advantage, and they take advantage. They utilize that power advantage, and you're limited in your choices because of their advantage over you. So it's most of what we do in life is cooperative exchange, because the world is mostly an imbalance of power around us. But uh, what you want to perceive is that someone has come to live out your ideas completely voluntarily, consensually, with all the options in the world. You want that is the height of apex existentiality for the ideational. And
Okay, that
then
totally makes sense.
there is the genetic, and the genetic is, it's not just having babies and making kids. Because the genetic can be genetic ideational or genetic physiological. I don't know if there's a genetic. So far, I don't think so. I think genetic is either genetic ideational or genetic physiological. So the genetic is when you want everyone to know it's you, and you want that to be spoken after your death. So even if it's physiological, like if you're a sports star, you want to be perceived as being the height of that sports excellence, and you want your name to be shared, and you want everybody to hold on to that name after you die. So that's the ideation, the genetic. Some people can pursue the ideational without the genetic, or the physiological without the genetic. But yeah, I don't know if that helps. That's how does that relate to your three tiers? And
Well, so you're using genetic a little differently than I'm familiar with. So did you already say the physiological in that last thing that you said, or haven't you gotten
mm,
there yet?
no, well, the physiological is the perception of yourself being the expression of whatever physiological frames you recognize that others might recognize, and perceiving that you are the apex of that physiological. It's anything from being a sports star to being a great singer. That's a physiological. It's the expression of the self in the physical.
Well, so does this only apply to some people? I mean, because certainly
I
there must be many people who have no, that's not in their framework of goals at all, to be the greatest sports star, or the greatest singer, or, to be known on
well,
that level.
my apex existentialism walks out the path of how it is that people come to adjust their apex existentialities as they become aware of their limitations. And some human being and their limitations, this is my perception, to me, is a war between the will to perceive and the reality of power. Uh,
Okay, so let's start right there,
you
because
see how it's hard for me to, there's so many things that are interconnected, and every time I try to talk about this one part, then I have to introduce these terminologies, and it's difficult.
Yeah, but I think we got to an important piece right here. A war between the will to perceive and the reality of power. Now, first of all, what do you mean when you say the will to perceive?
The will to perceive is, so I believe that the apex existentiality within us is planted by God. That it is this eternity placed in your heart. Ecclesiastes 3:11. In a phenomenological sense, the way this happened, you could is evolutionarily. We have biofeedback systems, and I don't pretend to know the biofeedback system for me and my system is a black box right now. I don't know the details, but it's anything the chemicals that are released in your body, the electrical impulses, the magnetics, whatever ranges that we have that compels an organism to act. Organisms must act, and so they must. There must. It is what creates value. I don't believe that value is the initiator. I believe apex existentiality is the initiator. So you are born with this range of apex existentialities, like the parable of the talents. Some people have 5, 2, 1, and your body, this biofeedback system rewards you when you are perceiving that you are pursuing the apex existentiality successfully or you're achieving it. So your
Okay, so
whole perception.
when I think about this, I think about when when you align with reality, when you line up with reality, that's when your motion forward it creates the best of it is the that's the good. When you align with reality, that's the good. So um, when um, when you make a choice or you do something, and action is that action bears good consequences, then that shows you that you have aligned with reality. And when it bears bad consequences, it shows you that you must adjust your behavior. And if you don't adjust your behavior, you're going to continue to experience bad consequences because you haven't aligned with reality.
Now, I don't look at it that way. I don't believe that you're aligning with reality. Like I said, it's a
Well,
war
that's
between.
because our reality is in my mind, reality is a really big word.
It
It's one of
is.
those, yeah, it has a very, very big meaning. So, um,
So reality for me is that's why I say the reality of power more than I do reality, because reality is, well, the schizophrenic is on the higher end of the one extreme end of the scale, and the extreme pragmatic might be on the other end, on the end of the scale. That might not be exactly good, but the schizophrenic is able to create perception that defies the reality of power, whereas the pragmatic is a slave to the reality of power, and does very little in terms of creating perception. The self creates perception, but not entirely. Perception is also invaded by the reality of power, where you sense limitation in your body. Whatever it is that produces your power to perceive is not able to overcome, because your body always wants to perceive that it is pursuing the apex existential within it successfully. It never wants to experience disappointment and loss. Now, when I use those terms loosely, because you might want to experience what looks like disappointment and loss for reasons that actually satisfy your apex existentiality. Like some people can develop an apex existentiality that centers around them being the greatest victim of all time. So for them, they might be.
so what you mean when you say that is you mean that people allow their innate apex existentiality to become corrupted so that then they create it in their own image. Their desire to be a victim actually alters their apex existentiality from that which with which they were born. Because you said we're born with an apex existentiality.
Well, what you're thinking of apex existentiality as, like I gave the first example, that it means, well, let me try to back up here. I think that what I need to do is to describe the process by which you adjust your apex existentiality. And I believe that it takes you to two paths, two extreme paths. One path is the heart of flesh, and one part is the stone heart. So what happens is you have a desire for apex existentiality that you form initially when you're born. Your apex existentiality is just simply maybe not feeling pain, not feeling hunger, not feeling want. So when you're born, you cry out because you immediately experience the grief that your apex existentiality is shattered. You're in this womb, you don't have to do anything. It's just, you don't have to eat, you don't have to think about it. It's all there. Most humans, I think, would go through this. Now, what happens to humans that experience trauma in the womb, that's another story. I haven't gotten to that yet. And I'll have to deal with that eventually. But you're born and you immediately experience some degree of loss of apex existentiality. You cry out and you get satisfaction. You get relief, and that's why babies cry. In my theory, babies cry because crying gets you back on the path to apex existentiality. As your perception uh, interacts with the other, with the non-self, as your perception builds the non-self, and I include everything as the non-self, then you begin to build vehicles of power. These are patterns of action that you can see yourself entering into, that you perceive you have the capacity to excel in. So,
Slow down a second. Vehicles of power are in which you can see yourself.
this is how you enter into the world, through vehicles of power. This is
Can you give me
John
an
Vervaeke's
example?
relevance realization.
Okay,
Uh,
vehicle of power is relevance realization.
it is. Well, I think it is. I'll say that. I think it is. So the vehicle's power create the relevance. It's how you get the relevance realization, is you recognize a vehicle of power that you can enter into. So early on in my life, for instance, for whatever reason, I made jokes and I learned quickly that I was reasonably funny. And as a skinny little kid that had very little physiological potential, I learned early on that I had an ideational power, although I didn't think of it that way, more than a physiological power that I could enter into and succeed in. That the world would uh, give back signals to me that made my body sense that I was pursuing an apex existentiality, being the funniest person, for instance. And so I became, I beat it into the ground. I became a class clown, just joking all the time, and because that was my thing, that was my vehicle of power. But as people started to get annoyed with me being always making jokes, I had to adjust my apex existentiality, because it wasn't giving me, my body wasn't sending me the messages anymore that I was succeeding. So
Okay, so Jordan Peterson talks about the hierarchies and how every person needs to be moving up a hierarchy in order to get the signals that they need in order to feel successful, in order to be able to put their shoulders back, in order to be able to move forward into the world. Because if you're always down at the bottom and you don't have a vehicle of power to rise up a hierarchy, then you're just bereft, and life becomes completely meaningless, and you either go into a, a violent kind of a nihilism, or you go into just completely giving up on life and
if
walking.
you perceive why people kill themselves, why people shut down, why people go mad and create whole worlds, is
Mhm.
they come to the point where there's no vehicle of power for them to enter into.
So they haven't found in
And
Jordan Peterson's terminology, it would be they haven't found a hierarchy which they can climb, because there are many different hierarchies available. Like, let's say you have a kid who's a skinny little kid, and maybe he's not this is not you, okay, but some other little kid. he can't make it up the hierarchy of intellect because he can't focus, and he can't make it up the hierarchy of football, but he is funny. So he can make it up the hierarchy of getting people's attention through humor. And so that gives him some position in the world. Is that what you mean by vehicle of power?
Well, yeah, yeah. I don't know that I would use a term like hierarchy, and I don't. Also, I want to make it clear that we have multiple apex existentialities within us. It's not like this one thing. And what
Well,
happens?
all of us have multiple hierarchies that we're acting within. I mean,
Right,
I'm acting within the mother hierarchy and the wife hierarchy and the artist hierarchy and the talking head hierarchy.
right,
All of these different hierarchies that I'm operating within.
right. And in my frame, or in my I don't know what I'm going to call it. What happens is there's a way for your body is just constantly looking to get reassurance that it's pursuing the apex existential. So most of the highest levels of apex existentiality we're going to figure out pretty early on we will not meet. What we all want to be deep down, especially in our stone hearts, is the psychopath that rules the world and can control everyone and everything around us. This is the height of the stone flesh apex existentiality. And what happens is, as we learn that we are incapable of achieving this highest level of apex existentiality, we adjust our bodies to, first off, we go into a vicarious mode. This is why we watch sports, because now we are vicariously experiencing the apex existential through others. This is why politicians exist, because people are entering into that psychopath. I call all politicians psychopaths. So that's how I mean, I don't know. I mean, especially maybe not so much at the local level, but the higher level you get up, where you're wheeling and dealing in circumstances that cause, this decision means death to this group and life to this group. You have to be a psychopath to be able to do that on a daily basis. To me, you have to be. And we pursue that apex existentiality vicariously through others. And that apex existentiality requires certainty, requires absoluteness, and requires a perception that there's a final completion of the goal, that you'll get to the top, even though ultimately you really don't want to get to the top because you'll want to continue. I do believe that you do, as people say, you do need the journey. But even though you need the journey, you still your body, and the way that your body gives you your biofeedback reward system is looking for you for the perception that you're walking in the is, was, and always will be. That you've always been, you always have, will be. It's basically your God is essentially what you're doing.
Well, so I need to clarify something here, because earlier on you said that your apex existentiality is God's eternity placed in your heart, that
Mm-hmm.
he has placed in your heart a framework, let's say, for lack of a better word.
Ecclesiastes 3:11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has placed into man's heart eternity, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. So it's an eternity that is intended to limit your capacity to know God fully as well.
And that it consists of these biofeedback systems that we have that.
Well, it doesn't consist of it. The biofeedback systems, well, that's a tricky thing there. And that's another problem I'm having is, did the biofeedback system, well, the way that I see God work, God works emergently. So I believe God worked through the evolutionary process. So the biofeedback systems evolved to create the apex existentiality, but then didn't. If you can both create and not create at the same time, but
Well,
in a phenomenological sense, I would have to say yes, the biofeedback system is what creates the apex existentiality.
well,
But
here's where I need some clarification, though. If there are two paths that we go, we either go towards the heart of flesh or the heart of stone. Whatever apex existentiality is functioning in the heart of stone is one that has been corrupted from its original intent.
yes,
Am I correct? Yes.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Uh,
Let me
the
tell you a little story about art, because this might give us a connection where we can understand inside each other's heads. Whenever an artist begins a painting, whether it's going to be a representational painting or an abstract painting, whatever it might be, they have something inside their heads that they're thinking, this is going to be glorious. This is going to be amazing. Okay. And
been there.
yeah, and you lay out your paints and you've already created some limits because you've chosen certain colors to work with, and you've chosen a certain shape of substrate to work on, and you've chosen a certain type of medium to work with. So you've already created certain limits, which have limited what can be produced because of those choices. But the first stroke that you lay down further limits what's possible, because now every other
Hmm.
stroke is going to relate to that stroke. And the more strokes that you put down, as you relate to those strokes through your own framework, you're more and more and more limiting what you can actually produce. So you can never really get to that thing that was originally in your head, because everything keeps getting limited more and more and more as you work, until finally you end up with what you end up with. And maybe in your own mind, you're thinking, gosh, that isn't what I intended at all. And yet, whatever you ended up with, because it went through all of your own framework and all of your own filter, may actually be saying to others that glorious thing that was in your mind to begin with, but you can't see it anymore because you've limited your own perception based on your actions.
Yeah. Uh, I recently discovered this philosopher, Deleuze. Have you ever heard of him?
How do you spell it?
Deleuze, Deleuze. Well, I guess him and this guy Guattara. Guattara is a psychoanalyst, so they work together. Now, I'm not necessarily. I just discovered him maybe a couple months ago, and he died in the 90s, and he was writing up to the 90s. But he wrote a book with this Guattara called it was called the Anti-Oedipal Complex. He's basically going after. I don't know if you know Lacan. He's a psychoanalyst, and but he is basically advocating for schizophrenic thought. And so the Guattaro guy, he also developed. I don't know much about this yet. I'm still investigating, but it's called schizoanalysis. And the idea here is that where we get to, in a way, it's kind of like John Vervaeke when he's talking about how in 40,000 years ago you had the shaman. The shaman enters into a schizophrenic state, and it's in that state where I believe you are closely aligned with the I'll just say the quantum part of your brain. This is what you're describing. The quantum part of your brain is where the quantum part of the brain, the way that, I think you know better than me how quantum mechanics and all these things work, but how a quantum computer works is it processes everything all at once. Whereas the the binary computers, they're going point A, point B, point C, point D, and this is where the hiccup is. Even for me, my apex existentialism, in trying to get it out of my head, it exists strongly in this quantum state, everything, but getting it out point by point by point. That's the problem with art. Like some of what you do, I recognized right away. You are the way that you decide to swath over this and take that focus away. I'm too much owned on that, so I have to get rid of it. And he's a philosopher of what's called difference. So it's all about sustaining the difference. Whenever you enter into the sameness, then it shuts you off, it limits you, and cuts you off from understanding. So I think that's what you're describing there, and I can relate to that. And the apex existential does exist. It exists in the quantum state, and then you have to convert that to the A, B, C, D, which is always incredibly more prosaic than whatever's in your head. But like I think I talked about in the last show, I talked about um, oh, what's his face, the Duchamp, and how Duchamp allowed for chance and chaos to. And I know some people don't like that word chaos, but and I don't think chaos, by the way, means no meaning. I've never thought chaos means no meaning. Chaos is as meaningful as order. They work hand in hand.
I totally
Um,
agree. I
yeah,
mean, I
yeah,
prefer the paradigm of the known and the unknown
yeah. But
because,
I don't like that either because the unknown. I think that you do know. You know more of the unknown than you do, but you haven't processed it
well,
to
but
the
that's,
linear.
yeah, but that's I mean, it's using the words known and unknown slightly differently than way most people
Oh
do.
yeah, yeah,
But the
yeah.
known is more that which has been established, and the unknown is that which has not yet been established.
Hasn't been mapped.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm not for maps of meaning. I'm for maps of apex existentiality,
Well, so I
which
want to get into that thing that you have about meaning, because I know you have a thing about that we're not.
meaning and value trigger me. Meaning and value trigger. Although I recognize that value is action. You could say it's action, and value is why we act. But I don't believe that value. I do not believe that value is the creator. God is not value. God is the source of value, but he is not value. And I believe what separates us from God fundamentally is eternity. And it will always separate us. We will enter into eternity going forward, but we will never ever understand the mind of God because God has no beginning. Everything else has a beginning, and that's what separates us from understanding him.
Mhm.
So that first act, when did God create? Like you can't say God created at a certain time because time didn't exist. So when did God create? That first act, was that an act that necessitated value? I can't process how an act can happen without value, but I believe God acted without value. And that to wrap everything around value to me limits God to it almost moves towards uh what do you call it? What's the word when not where God is in all things, but he is also pan. Oh, can't remember the word. Where he's in all things, but he's also outside of the things.
Panentheism.
Yeah, panentheism. Yes, it kind of moves in that direction to me. That's why I eschew. I'm hesitant to wrap my whole world around value, where everything you assume is beginning and ending with value. You
Well,
remove the agency of God.
that was why I felt uncomfortable with Mark Solmes's thesis that our consciousness arises solely from our brainstem's value differentials. That I felt very, so someday I would like to have that conversation with you about value in this whole perspective, because I think that would be a very interesting, good, in-depth conversation. But we need to set that aside for a second and get
Okay.
back to this issue of you were talking about the quantum part of the brain and how it functions holistically, looking at
Yes,
the
it
whole.
takes it everything all at once. It's an
Okay.
explosion of thought.
So
You've
let me read
experienced it.
you a quote
We
from
all have.
a video I was watching of Ian McGilchrist, because I thought he got at this from a very, he's the guy with the right and left hemispheres of the brain.
I don't know him.
Oh,
I've
well,
heard the name, but I don't know him.
you would love his book. It's called The
Okay.
Master and His Emissary. If you don't have time to read the book, there are plenty of YouTube videos where he talks about the main thesis of the book.
Well, if he's on Audible, then fine.
Okay,
I
yeah,
do everything. Well,
yeah.
I don't. I read too, but I do a lot of Audible. I love
Uh-huh.
Audible, and I
Well, his
1.75 speed. Get it in. You know.
his main thesis is that, well, he's a neuroscientist and a poet and a psychoanalyst. And so he looks at things from all these perspectives. And he talks about the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Roughly speaking, both hemispheres do everything. They do all the different parts. It's not that one side only does one part and the other side does the other part, but there is a difference in focus between the two hemispheres of the brain. The right hemisphere has a generalized exploratory focus on that which is outside, and the left hemisphere only gets the information that it gets from what the right hemisphere allows in. The right hemisphere allows it in, passes it over to the left hemisphere, and then the left hemisphere begins the process of atomizing it, breaking it down, using it to build new structures, that kind of analytical work. But the right hemisphere is much more holistic in its perspective. And he said this the other day on a discussion. I thought this was really interesting when he was thinking about meaning, okay? He said, nowadays, when people allow that there could be meaning coming from certain experiences, they see that as an invention of ours. So we do this and we think, okay, now we've added some meaning. But that's not the image. That's the left hemisphere's image of something that is added to something else mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is we are in certain experiences made to be more receptive, more aware of something that is there to be brought into being through the commerce between ourselves, our own consciousness, and whatever it is that we're conscious of. So it's a relational thing. Absolutely, at its core is relation, and at its core, it's consciousness. The core of the idea was that I felt already that there were two kinds of ways we could think about the world, two kinds of awareness of it that we use both. And as always, it's not either that you just collect data and then look at it
Mm-hmm.
and nothing happens, nor is
Yes.
it that you have an idea and you collect the data just to support it. It's like everything. It's a kind of an encounter, a rapprochement coming together of two things that sense each other's existence as two loving people come to understand one another. And as indeed we understand the sacred and the divine, it's a coming together of something that speaks to us and we speak to it. And if you don't speak to it, you won't hear anything back from it.
I don't know how he's using sacred and divine, but
Well, he's not a believer.
but I appreciate, like, I am in I favor process type philosophical thought. So I believe in process. I believe in sustaining dialecticals,
Mhm.
sustaining contradictions, if you will. And I believe that that is where the real action lies. That's where the real knowing, understanding, wisdom happens. Is And so I would think of, like, I don't think of even the way that I view the world, the material world. I believe material world is real. Material is real. I believe material is real. I believe largely material is real because of the Bible. Because in Ezekiel chapter 36, God literally commands Ezekiel to prophesy to the mountains, and he has this whole prophecy. Why is God prophesying to the material if it doesn't exist? But I believe that what we perceive is not the material, and I don't believe in the. I'm not saying it's the thing in itself beyond us, but that the material and the ideal, or if you will, my will to perceive and the reality of power, in a sense, that that there is they both are kind of colliding. That there's no clear divide between them either. That it's a blurred line between the material and the ideal, and that's the process of converting one to the other and the other to the one, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, is where the world takes place, where understanding, or where knowledge takes place, where spirit takes place. When Jesus died on the cross, it said that he gave up his spirit, small s, and I believe the spirit is the knowledge. It's the part of self that enables you to take action. It is action, and it enables you to take action, and that's a process between these two. And even to extrapolate it out for the quantum part of the brain and the linear part of the brain. I absolutely believe, like, well, and I believe that's essentially what he's describing here is those two. There's no clear divide between them, and they're either at war with each other or they're coming to harmonization with each other. And when they're at war, then you have mental illness, you have disassociation, you have breakdown. And when they're harmonized, then you have flow. You enter into a flow state, so to speak.
Yeah, so his thesis is that over the course of history, you can tell when they've been at war with each other and when they've been harmonizing with each other. And that in our current state right now, they're at war with each other, and it's causing great heartache in the world and great problems because the technology has so completely colonized what you would call the linear way of thinking that
Yeah,
that the
we've
quantum
become
way,
so atomized.
yeah,
As Heidegger pointed out, what happens is, well, the way that I would word it, I talk about the factitious and how the factitious, the man-made, that the order, the craft creates an illusion in and of itself of is, was, and always will be. You don't question the order. You only question when you see a flaw, which is, I think I talked to the last time about why I think that the Eastern Orthodox, if you look at their iconography could be way more beautiful than it is, and it's intentionally not made to be so fully crafted because they're trying to keep that the eternality should be in what it symbolizes, not in the material that created it. And yeah, I'll just say that.
yeah, that's really good. When you said the is, was, and always will be, and you used the word the order, are you talking about something like the way the world was represented in 1984, where people were perpetually kept in a state of believing that it was always this way, and all the news that might have told them that actually something else was happening was being rewritten, stuffed down the memory hole, just
I
happens to
think
be, well,
so. I'm going to say something that's kind of out there, and I might
as if
fail.
you haven't
And
already said some out there.
right, okay, all right. Uh, but I believe that the ideas that people hear aren't as important as the vehicles through which they're expressed and who possesses those vehicles. This is why, well, in the Peasants' Revolt 1381, before that, what led up to it was they passed all these laws and regulations that were aimed at preventing peasants from owning high levels of craft. So they had the sumptuary laws. So you could afford to buy the same things that the nobles could buy, but the nobles couldn't have that. They need to, the authority, the power needs to possess the highest levels of factitiousness. And so in 1984, it wasn't as important that these people were filling you with these ideas, because if they filled you with these ideas and they were filling it from a little rinkety dink TV set with grainy pictures, while you over here could produce high quality pictures, you wouldn't listen to them. But they possess the factitious. When you possess the factitious, you can get people to believe almost anything, as long as you're that's why, like what's going on with YouTube, how they have at some point they shifted from being YouTube to, I call it corpotube. I'm not the first to say that, but and now they're trying to limit our ability to produce the same high levels of craft that the corporations can produce. They don't want the average person to be able to produce high quality movies, high quality, even what we're doing right here. This is, I mean, you and I, you're older than me, and I only say that because of what you've said is indicative, not because you look older, because you look about the same age as me. But I was surprised when you were like, "Well, I can't believe, I thought you were in your 50s like me." But
Thank you.
anyway, so you know even more than me. Like there's a high level of factitious craft, seduction to this image that we're looking at, to being able to speak and have yourself filmed and put into a nice little productive package, I own the same level of factitious power that the rich corporations do. This is why people are listening less and less to authority, why they're listening less and less to the news, and they're trying to get it back. This is why they wanted to stop the printing press. Because before that, who the heck wrote? Who wrote with any expectation that anything they said would be preserved? Only the wealthiest, or if you were lucky to have a wealthy patron. But only the wealthiest would dare to dream that their thoughts would be preserved because they controlled the factitious, because they had the scribes. Very expensive. Scribes are very expensive, as you know, and they're annoying. But so I think that 1984 is more a reflection of they controlled the means of factitiousness, and it's about controlling the means of factitiousness, of high levels of craft that give you the authority, the is, was, and always will be authority, if that makes
So
any sense.
that's what that was the part I wanted to clarify. The is, was, and always will be authority is that which keeps you in a frame that they want you to be in. Because
And then they can decide whatever they want. You know, once they have the control of the factitious, then they can decide whatever they want.
I remember reading 1984, must have been in 2011, maybe 2010, sometime in there. Maybe it was 2009. My daughter was supposed to read it for a class that she was in, and I wanted to read it so that I would be able to talk about it with her. And I had read it probably when I was, I don't know, in my early 20s, and had, swiftly forgotten it. It just didn't stick with me because what do you know when you're in your early 20s?
Right.
But in 2010, 2011, when I read it, I'm like, we are living in this right now in certain ways, in very interesting certain ways. But what really struck me is that by the time I got done with the book, I thought, we're totally being played. We're totally being played because we think that we have two parties. We think we have this big
Oh
debate,
gosh,
big
yeah, yeah.
ideas, and
No, we don't. That's all a show.
it's all a show. And we think we've been at war with Oceania and they've been at war with Europa. And
Yeah.
we think we're at war with these people that they want, and we're being played.
Well, I view the Republican Party as being the Washington Generals, and the Democrat Party as the Harlem Globetrotters. A friend of mine, actually, it was Ralph Pinko again. He's the guy that wrote the book with my brother. And he was saying how Joe Biden is running circles around the Republicans. I'm like, they control almost all of the means of factitiousness. And the Republican Party is still overwhelmingly dominated by Washington generals. They're in on it, so to speak. I'm not for say this. I forget the guy's name. Oh, man, I can't remember. It's Edward something or other. But he talks about how now he has this conspiracy theory, the Balfour Accord, somewhere around Balfour. Some people are the Balfour Accord was involved with Israel, but it was during that period of time that they come up with this strategy to basically create adversaries, so that human beings had this sense that their dreams could come true. So they had to have adversaries, because if you just have one party, then people will more quickly figure out they're being oppressed. So they created these adversarial parties that would be token resistance, and they would decide. I don't know if I fully believe his conspiracies. I'm just saying.
Yeah, so I think that's a completely unnecessary conspiracy because Cain and Abel created the adversarial parties way back when.
Well, yeah.
As human beings, we don't have any need for someone else to create adversarial parties for us to fall into.
That's our they're creating, they're not really adversaries, obviously, but what they're creating is, if you don't like something, wait 4 years and you can change it. But you really can't. But if you didn't think that you had 4 years, you would take to the streets right now. A lot of people are starting to figure that out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people out there that are working for the Democrats right now. They don't realize it. Well, I won't. I will say it.
Yeah.
I call them the green shirts. They're the green shirts. And now Joe Biden just recently said that he he said that he all of a sudden now he's saying, well, whatever happened with this latest police shooting thing, that nothing violent protest whatever aren't necessary, and now my reality of power, I'm looking and I'm thinking, okay, the powers that be are signaling something here, and it might very well be that the powers that be have found the green shirts are no longer useful. They're about ready to turn on them because they've consolidated power, so they no longer need them to continue. They needed them to upset the inside so that they could from the outside get in, but now that they're in, now they no longer need this kind of these outsider forces coming against them anymore. So yeah, and
Well,
I'm
I'm at a disadvantage here because I don't pay any attention to politics anymore.
and
Haven't.
I wouldn't either if I
Yeah.
didn't. I have a paying gig, so that's why. Otherwise, I'm
Yeah.
not interested in politics anymore. I'm interested in evangelizing through politics because we're a Christian site, so I opportunities to talk about the absurdity of what you're seeing, and in a sense, kind of letting everybody know, you're being played. This is a written script almost. I mean, it's not exactly a written script, and they don't control everything. They're messy thinkers. They have to surround themselves by people who will conform, and that limits the, if you have to conform, then it limits the imagination. So they make
Well, I mean, so
mistakes.
that's Jordan Peterson's whole thing, right? That all ideologies are just incomplete religions. They're just a piece, and but if you get addicted to that piece and you get swallowed up in there, you get this reciprocal narrowing that John Vervaeke's always talking about, where
You
the
kind
whole
of,
world just narrows into this one picture that you have and you can't get outside of it. And I see that happening to both parties.
oh yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
it's
They
cannibalistic.
can't see any
It,
truth whatsoever outside of their own frame. And it
well,
really
because
hinders their potential to accomplish anything meaningful.
on my apex existential scale, the one end of the scale is the absolute the absolute stone heart, which leads to, well, it relies on certainty, it relies on absolutes, it relies on promises of absolute fulfillment. In order for you to have power over people, you have to speak certainly, confidently, and otherwise they're not going to follow you. It's human nature. We're just not going to do that. So the height of apex existentiality requires the one living it out to lie all the time. They have to lie because there's no certainty. I mean, there is certainty, but we have no access. God is certain. God is absolute. But there is no certainty that the humans can grasp. And so the human has to lie. Whenever a human is certain, they're lying. Whenever a human is absolute, they're lying. Whenever a human promises fulfillment of a grand scheme, they're lying. And they have to immediately, coercively control the narrative. Everything in politics is about control the narrative, control the narrative, control the narrative. It's all about narrative. And politicians, they all, the sophisticated, they all say perception is reality. And what they mean is whatever I can get you to perceive, that's what I have to do. And that's the one end of the scale. And the other, and that is the stone heart continuing to not sense loss, to not sense diminishment, to not sense within themselves that they're pieces of human, in a sense, we're all human garbage. I mean, we're not just human garbage, but we are. We're all lacking. We're all immoral. We're all fragile. We all could die any second. And this is where I get, from existentialism, I get that embracing your death and why it's important to embrace your death, to embrace the fragility of who you are, because that will make you come to terms more with who you are. You'll experience more loss, and the more loss, the more diminishment you feel, the more you will come to understand that there is no certainty. So you're no longer chasing certainty, and you're no longer actually chasing after an apex existentiality directly. You're vicariously chasing an understanding of the apex existential that you'll never fulfill. That's the Christian life. The Christian life is the extreme, the heart that has come to terms with its own limitations, with its own wretchedness, if you will. And most all of us, we just don't want to look at. We don't, like you said, don't stare into the abyss. You know, the abyss is you, and we all have the abyss within us. And Lacan talks about how the real is this it's this infinite possibility that drowns you, and it exposes you as the fragile wreck of a person that you are. And so he has this imaginary and symbolic creates reality, and then the real is always underneath. And I like that. I'm not sure how much I'll incorporate that, but I like that. But so the apex existential in the stone heart basically emerges from your refusal to experience diminishment. And so you become Hitler, or you become a fan of Hitler. You become an ideologue. You now can, and remember what I said, where your apex existentiality, you have to perceive that the other that is taking your ideas, or recognizing your physiological apex existentiality, that they're doing so consensually. Because if they're not doing it consensually, that's not real power. Real power is they come to you. And so you have to create illusions, mythologies that allow you to define human beings as being part of you or not part of you, as your tribe or the other, and you have to subhumanize the other. You have to create the conditions that allow you to murder people outside of the parameters of what I say, the parameters of Romans 13, for not for reasons in which you're violating others directly, but because you're white, or because you're black, or because you're Catholic, or whatever it is. You have to you have to subhumanize people that you can't get to even trick them into feeling like even though you are still you're cooperatively seducing them. You're not actually they're not coming to you consensually, they're coming to you cooperatively. But you can create these conditions that allow you to perceive that, and that's complicated. But so you have to then make them something that's not human, because if they're not human, then it's just a thing that's a rock that's in your way. And that's how you can sustain that perception of walking in the is, was, and always will be, the upside down Christ.
That's how we got Dred Scott and Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to go back to what you said about humiliation, because it's very interesting that you bring this up today, because last night my husband and I were watching a short message by the guy that used to be the pastor of our church. And he was wonderful pastor, wonderful teacher. Through a series of events, he was removed from the church. It's very complicated, but humiliation was what was used to remove him and to put him in the most humiliating situation possible. So I can't talk any more about it than that, but he was giving this little short message yesterday about the beauty of humiliation and what it produces in the person. And it was almost exactly the words that you used. And then he said, in a way, he said, humility is he went back to the garden, and the humility versus the pride was the whole crux of the thing that went on in the garden with the serpent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
let us become like God.
Yeah, when
that's the stone heart.
And the humility is the coming to grips with reality. And so I've been thinking about, I think I told you, for years I've been thinking about this idea that if you can come to grips with the reality of sin, that will prove to you that God exists.
Yeah, I heard you say that, as I'm really fascinated by that.
Yeah.
Could you go into a little bit more detail? Because
Well, it's like one of these things that I see the whole big thing here, but it's very hard to articulate.
Yeah,
put it into words.
Okay, I can
But
relate to that.
but if yeah, but if I just try to take this thread back to the garden with this whole idea of humility versus pride, what really happened in the garden when the serpent spoke to Eve is he was saying to her, you can't really rely on the fact that God is good and that his desire is to care for you and to be good. You can't rely on that. There's something else that you should be wanting. Let me plant that desire in your heart. Okay, um, so the basis of sin is thinking that I'm enough, that I don't need God, that I
Hmm.
know enough, that
I
I,
can overcome.
yeah,
The basis of word of faith. I can overcome.
yes. So sin is not relying on God, not relying on God because you refuse to believe that God is good. But when people look at sin, when people talk about sin, usually they talk about sins. Oh, he had an affair with somebody, or he murdered somebody, he was unkind to that person. They always put it in the framework of sins. But those sins arise out of that basic thing that's inside of not relying on God, not trusting God. And if you can get down to the bottom of really looking at what sin is, that even if you can't believe in God, but you come to a realization that sin is at bottom pride, then once you begin to look at that, you have to start thinking about where on earth does pride come from? Because everything, you were talking before about how everything is a scale, right? You go from, it's a polarity. You have to
Hmm.
go from one end to the other. So
It's a
Jordan
series
Peterson
of
says
diminishing
his,
returns. Well,
yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, Jordan Peterson's basic thing is he came to a recognition that pain is real. Pain and suffering are real. And if you recognize that pain and suffering are real, then you have to do something about it. Otherwise, it's just going to be your life from now on, nothing but pain and suffering. But that's one end of a scale. So if there is pain and suffering, there must be something up at the other end. There must be something you can work towards that is not pain and suffering. If there is evil in the world, there has to be something up at the other end of the scale that is not evil. And if
So the
there,
perception of evil creates the the counter perception.
yes, creates a necessity for good. But the opposite of pride is what? The opposite of pride is humility.
Hmm.
And
And Moses was the most humble of them all.
well, Christ was the most humble of them all.
Well, of us humans, I mean,
Yeah.
no, Christ is that's a whole different story.
Well, but
But
so at the opposite end of pride is humiliation, and the cross
oh,
is,
I see where you're going. Yes,
yeah,
yes,
so the cross is our greatest symbol of humiliation. You're
it
stripped of
certainly
everything.
is,
Yeah.
and it's see what's mind-boggling. This is why, like, I'm all for the cosmological argument. I respect it. I think it's great, but I don't pin my hope on science. I know that science is a fickle mistress, and tomorrow there will be a discovery that says, "No, wait, the universe is eternal," and then 10 years from now, another discovery says, "No, no, 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 we were wrong." So I'm not pinning my hope on science, but I do pin my hope on that narrative, and that's a vehicle of power that I can enter into vicariously without having to I don't even have to achieve it. I just enter into his story vicariously, and I don't even have to fully understand it. I know enough that the Almighty, the true is, was, and always will be, entered into the physicality, a physically fragile, limited being who yet wasn't. And that power, that that pure power, the greatest power of them all. And by the way, I don't look at power as good or bad. It just is. Uh, that power submitted itself. It submitted itself to the heart of the earth, like when Jesus in I think of Matthew 8 is the only or in Matthew, is it Matthew 8 or no, Matthew 12? Matthew 12. Jesus says to the Pharisees that they said, "Give us a sign," and he says he only says this in Matthew 12. He says, "The only sign I'll give you is the sign of Judah, Jonah, where Jonah was in the belly of the whale, like Jonah was in the belly of whale for 3 days and 3 nights, he says. And then he says, in the heart of the beast, in the heart of the earth, I will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Never says it anywhere else. Jesus was not on the cross for 3 days and 3 nights. The heart of the earth is authority. It's rule through death, and he's ruling through life. And this, this Godhead that came into this physicality, and as you know, like he said, when they showed up, I could call the angels down and I'll be toast. Satan tempts him. That's the first temptation. I think it's the first. No, it's the third one. Now I don't remember which one. Which one of the temptations was it? Where Satan promises, "Look, I'll give you these kingdoms. I will give you. I will shortcut it. You don't have to take this." He's basically saying, "You don't have to take the," because Satan knows there's a cup of suffering coming. He doesn't understand it, but he knows Christ in his flesh is. That's why he's sweating blood at the end. That's why he falls on his face, and he needs angels to minister to him, because that flesh, that spirit, that small s spirit, is going to experience incredible pain and suffering beyond anything you and I could ever imagine, because he's entering into the full sin nature of humanity and taking it and wiping it away. And that there's nothing out there, no other religion, no other mythology that has anything close to that story of the supernatural being entering into this world and demonstrating to us all how fragile we are, how hopeless we are, how broken we are. It is a powerful compass that guides us towards the heart of flesh rather than the heart of stone. The heart of flesh points us to comfortable with uncertainty, comfortable with our lack of power, because through Christ we have an infinite power that we'll never understand in this life. Through Christ we have our apex existentiality, and we don't have to seek the approval of humans. We don't need to perceive that humans are consensually coming to worship us, in essence, because we've rejected it. We don't need it because we have walked into his story. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but for
Well,
me,
that was beautiful. But it also made me think about how this act of being willing to become less and less and less of myself is in Christianity is differentiated from something like Zen,
well,
where
Zen,
you're becoming less of yourself just
you're
so that
becoming nothing.
yeah, so you can become nothing so that you can
And
be, or I have heard other people, I've even heard people who are Christian people who talk about that, but it's not actually becoming nothing, it's becoming more and more hollowed out so that there's more and more room for Christ. Not so that there's
well,
more and more room for nothing, but there's more and more room for
yes.
Christ. So
Well, the
and
difference
Christ in
between,
me is more of who he initially intended me to be. Not
you become in Zen, your goal is to escape creation.
mhm,
In Christianity, your goal is to become a master of creation through Christ, and you are the stone heart is what's being undone. The flesh heart is becoming. And the flesh heart is, in the end, it's a perfect variation, if you will, of perfect diverse expression of Christ. And see, Christ, to me, it's driven home when he talks about the nature of our faith, is that Christ, he values us all as the collective, as the whole, but at the same hand, he also values the individual. That he values the individual expressions of himself is essentially what we become, individual expressions of himself. You and I will never be one, but we are one. But even in heaven, we'll never be one, but we are one. We are a diverse expression of Christ. When he stops and he says, I have 99 sheep, they're all fine. One sheep is missing. That sheep matters more than anything else. I stop everything to find that one freaking sheep. That to me, I always think of that as a reminder that the significant difference between Zen and Christianity right there, or just Buddhism in general, as I understand Buddhism, and I'm no Buddhist expert, but yeah, we're not striving after nothingness. We're not striving after at not becoming. We are striving after the stone heart unbecoming and the flesh heart becoming, and that flesh heart is the diverse expression of Christ. Unity and diversity, which, by the way, ironically enough, is Indian. It comes from India. It's their national motto. That little wheel on their flag that symbolizes unity and diversity. It's the whole, and then the individual parts, the spokes that But you need those individual expressions for the whole to be fulfilled. It's kind of like in emergent thinking as well, where it's the whole is more than the sum. But in a way, maybe as I'm thinking this out loud, maybe it's something more, because it's not just the whole is more than the sum of the parts. It is the parts themselves have value in and of themselves. That's the thing. You have intrinsic value. You're not just here to be a part of the whole, although you are, but you're also here to be that one sheep that's lost that he'll stop everything for. He's not trying to assimilate everybody. He's not the Borg.
Yeah. Well, in other places in the scripture, I think it's in Paul's writing in the epistles, he talks about how the church is the body of Christ. And then he begins to detail all the different parts of the body.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
might be the toe, you might be the ear, you might be the eye, you might be an eyelash. Who knows what part of the
Yeah.
body you are? But every part of the body has a specific purpose, and that Christ is the head of the body. And you may have heard me tell this story before, but years ago we had an arborist come to work on a tree in our backyard, and he was looking at one tree that was not a very attractive tree, and he said, "Did your husband cut the head off of that tree?" And I said,
I
"Well,
heard this. I saw this
yeah."
on. I love that story.
He gets a
Uh,
little bit crazy sometimes when he's trimming things. Well, what happens when you cut the head off a tree is that, and this I think is very mysterious, all the information that a tree needs in order to gain its proper shape, because every tree has a different kind of a shape that it's supposed to be, but all that information is in the crown. So if you cut the crown off of a tree, it loses its capacity to make its intended shape.
yes.
So when you cut Christ out of the church, then the church might survive, but it's going to survive as something very twisted and malformed. And all
Well,
parts are not going to be intrinsically useful, and won't grow into the beautiful thing that it's intended to be.
I look at the churches today, and I've said that the way that I view churches now is I view them as toes and fingers, disembodied, and they emerged they emerged naturally from Christian civilization, where wherever you went, there was God. It was assumed. Even the church underground, in the book of Acts and then thereafter, the church underground, they had civilization. Jesus tells us if somebody sues you, don't go to court. Settle. Never go to court. Never submit yourself to the heart of the earth. So the heart of the earth is all around us. That's the civilization that rules. And for significant period of time, when the church that we have now, the methodology by which we gather to worship together as a body, that was an extension of a full civilization, a full Christian civilization. And that Christian civilization is no more. And so now these churches are just floating out these disembodied fingers and toes, and they're still built and formed in the same way. And I'm not knocking churches. I recently started going back to church, and I just went there. I go to church because that's where the Christians are. I got to go where the Christians are. But I could still decry the conditions of the church, which is we're worship centers without businesses, without farms, without our own doctors and scientists. We don't have scientists working in the laboratory to come up with technologies that enables Christians to be self-sustaining, to have we should have microgrids. You know what microgrids are? Little mini power centers, micro factories for that, where we use 3D printers, and we can have micro factories. There's the technology available today for us to have this power for Christian civilization is here. And we don't have to take their places. We don't have to, the seven, I don't know if you know about the Seven Mountains people. They're kind of the apostolic, the new apostolics and all that. And they have this, their idea is that they want to take back the culture, win the culture war. And no, we're not called to win. That's their culture. We're called to be a culture. And we don't take their culture with guns. We take their culture. Well, if we take it at all, their culture. Well, we don't take their culture. Their culture dissolves in the face of what does Jesus say? I love this when he says in John 13, he says, and before it was he says love your enemies. It's in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount. The new standard, the spiritual standard of the law is to love your enemies. And he takes it a notch higher. First it's love your neighbors, then it's love your enemies, and then it's the ultimate, to love one another as I have loved you. That's a whole other level. That's way beyond the golden rule. Way beyond. This is when people say Jesus got the golden rule from. No, he's went way past the golden rule, because his standard is you love as Christ loved us. And how did Christ love us? He's loved us. He acted like a slave to us. He washed our feet, literally washed our feet, and he died on a cross for us while we were murdering him. I murdered him. You murdered him, and while we did that, he died. I mean, that's incredible. That is way beyond the scope of anything that anybody can imagine. So the standard is, how do we show that we love one another if we don't have a civilization to demonstrate it? How can they see our cities on top of the hill if we don't have cities? And this is what my brother and I are working on, trying to facilitate that. We're trying to create a diverse expression of this idea. The Eupidarian nation isn't the Christian nation, because the Christian nation is all of us, but it's a nested nation, and hopefully a model for other Christians with diverse expressions to build their own Christian nations, where we are literally building farms, and we are literally building. And what does a Christian civilization do? It ministers to one another. We equip the saints, and we, wherever all around us, we're reaching. To go to Jonathan Pageau, how that whole process works, where we get the wisdom comes into our heart, that's understanding, and then the understanding allows us to build the blueprint, and then to live it out, that's knowledge, that's the spirit, and the knowledge and the spirit leads us to constantly be looking for two things. We're looking for their high places and tearing them down, and we're lifting the low places up. So we're refugee centers, in essence, where we're equipping the body, and we're constantly going out. And I don't know if you know anything about the Moravians, the early Moravians, how revolutionary they were in terms of what they did to mission work. Matter of fact, this couple that just came, or this family that just came to the church that I'm attending, they're taught the way that they minister is how the Moravians ministered. The Moravians didn't go and preach to you. They didn't go, have you heard Jesus? And I'm not knocking people that do that. Ray Comfort has his, walks you through this accountability. So he brings you to accountability of your sin nature. And I'm not knocking that. Well, what they did is they just went out and they literally loved people. Now, I know progressive Christians, they kind of do this, but they never get around to the cross. They love people, but they never get to the cross. They love people looking for an opportunity to share the cross. So when the Moravians came to America, and I'm from Bethlehem, PA, which was founded by the Moravians, so I have it in my heart. I live in Bethlehem, PA. Actually, I'm not born here. But they came to America, and what they did is they built their whole structure was built to fund, equip, and train missionaries to go out into America and become natives. Not showing up with their Western clothes and teaching them their Western way. No. They went out, they learned their languages, they lived with them, they became them, and their love, how they loved one another, is what brought them to Christ. Yeah. Sorry about that little tangent there.
No, I totally agree. 1984, I had the tremendous opportunity of going to Champaign-Urbana, which is a massive, they meet every 3 years, and they have a massive missionary preparation conference, and all sorts of young people from all over the world come there to learn, and they have lots of breakout sessions of, and the whole thing that we learned there, because we were preparing to go as missionaries to Japan at that time, and the whole thing that we learned was this whole thing of going and actually becoming a native, learning the language.
That's Moravians. Moravians taught that, and everybody learned from them.
Yeah, and
They
it was a truly amazing experience to have that opportunity to learn. And then we spent 3 years in Japan, and I tried to live that out. I tried to live that out. There's a great book too that you might enjoy that reads almost like a book of fiction. It's such a thrilling book. It's called Bruchko, Bruchko. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it is the true story of a young man from Minnesota who wanted very much, he became a Christian as a teenager and he wanted very much to be a missionary. And he couldn't get any mission to accept him because they wanted him to go to college and do all these things that he didn't feel like he was being called to do at the time. So he somehow made his way to South America on his own and ended up accidentally getting captured by a tribe of cannibals. And the rest of the story is him living with them for 20 years as
wow,
a prisoner, and eventually having the opportunity to preach the gospel to them. It's it's an amazing story. And he
yeah,
never did, even after many of the tribe became Christians, and even after, and it was a hidden tribe that nobody had ever met these people before, even after he came back, even after they let him come back into civilization, he never tried to westernize them at all. He just worked within their culture to show them how the things within their culture they could make adjustments that would allow them to have better health and better
yeah.
sanitation and those
It's
kinds of things.
That's the
And
thing about the cross. The cross
yeah,
does not is not limited by language or culture or custom.
absolutely.
The cross resonates with all, for all, with all, for all. It speaks to everyone, and you don't have to change your manner of dress, so to speak, or your language, so to speak. You know, this couple, for instance, they went what they're known for. This is extraordinary that I happen to be it's a great experience. That was a great Sunday service, I'll just say. I went away, well, and I made this comment to my wife, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but even in my walk, when I'm really deep in my walk, where I really feel the Holy Spirit, it really is like you're at a funeral and a wedding at the same time, because you experience the fallen world and you grieve for it, but you also experience the joy of the cross. So it's like this mix that you walk in. But this couple, they went to Papua New Guinea, and they lived amongst them and loved them, and they worked to, rather than trying to teach them English, they translated the New Testament into their language
Mhm.
so that they had it in their language. For almost a millennia, the powers that be who had control of the Christian mythos, they wanted to lock that down. And it's at the 1300s. Well, it was before that. You had plenty of there were plenty of Protestants well before Martin Luther. By the way, there's a long history of quote unquote Protestants. The 1300s with John Wycliffe
Yeah, I was
in
just going to
England.
mention him. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it starts in earnestness, where you really see something. Other than that, it's like largely underground, and every once in a while, some flare up, and then they go and kill them. It's like wherever Christianity is partnered with the state, there's an upside down Christedness going on there, because the state does not submit itself to an authority that does not rule uh, with life. It's like why Herod was so upset when they said, "Is this Jesus? What is this Jesus guy? I don't know, man. Is he John the Baptist? I don't. I thought you killed John the Baptist. Whoa, did John the Baptist rise from the dead? Oh, that's a problem. Somebody conquered death. That's the last thing an authority wants to know, is that somebody conquered death. So I'm always worried wherever the state is comfortable with Christianity. I'm a little bit worried because I'm not saying that I mean, I'm an anarchist at heart, but pragmatically, I'm not trying to be an anarchist here. But yeah, I fundamentally mistrust that coupling, because state authority only rules with death. And I've never seen a state authority that stayed within the parameters of Romans 13. And if they have, it's been a small scale for a short period of time.
Well, what I picked up on here is that there's three things that you and I still have to explore. So I hope we can have another conversation.
I'd love that.
as we about come to our end time here, but I think meaning and freedom and value are three terms that we still need to explore. I think there's a lot of fertile ground there to be plowed. So
Yeah,
I'd be
yeah.
up
And
for it.
maybe in between meetings I could write more, because I tell you, like this thing that I have in me that I'm working on, like I haven't even come close to trying to describe it to you. And I probably did a poor job, but I tried my best. But I it is in largely in the quantum. Now when I write, I can get closer to it. Now when I speak, it's even harder to actually communicate this thing in me. But yeah.
And whatever happened when what happens to me whenever I start trying to write down the thing that's inside my head is that I'll start trying to break out one part of it and write on that, and then all the rest of it flows into that again. And then I'm like, well, I'm always telling the same story because whenever I'm trying to explain this one little part, the whole world falls into it.
That's what's happened to me.
Yeah.
Like even in this conversation with you, I'm trying to explain something, and then all of a sudden I have to bring in everything else. And it's like, okay, can't do that. I can't bring in all the if I'm trying to define terms, it's hard to define terms if I keep having to bring in other terms that aren't defined. And so many of these terms they're all interrelated. It's hard to atomize it. That's the problem. It's hard to atomize it in a way that I could walk this out linear A, B to C. Now, maybe if next time we talk, I would like at least an attempt to walk through the graph that I gave you, because I think that would help me a lot, describing to you the process of perception and how perception creates perception. Well, I don't want to say that, but anyway, how the exchange of perceiving, acting creates this feedback loop that allows you to constantly adjust your apex existentiality. That might help.
Yes, let's do that. Let's just take a look at your graph next time and then try to nail down meaning, freedom, and value as terminology so that we can make more headway later.
Yeah, that'd be
Um,
great.
Jordan
Although
Peterson
freedom is
always
one of
said
those
that
words
writing is the best way to organize your thoughts. So
it
yeah,
really is, and I've done tons of writing on this that nobody will ever see.
I I I have an
I think you can
entire
relate.
room filled with sheets of paper that have stuff written on them because I
Yeah.
can't rein in my brain.
And I also want to say, I want to be on your channel again, but and because I want to talk more about this, but I think I'd like to have you on. I have a couple of different channels, but I have one channel, my Action Batsa YouTube channel, it has like 250 subs, something like that. Now, the interesting thing about that is, at least I'd say a third of my subs are from Somalilanders. I don't know if you know anything about Somaliland, but I did a video on Somaliland, how it wants to achieve. Now, I love Somaliland because Somaliland is one of these places that's kind of between the state and anarchy. It's like a quasi state, and it has a long ethical tradition that mostly, it's very consensual minded ethical tradition. But I did this video, and the Somalilanders love me. It has 6,000 views, which, for a Somaliland audience, it's pretty impressive. So, like a third of my audience might be Somalilanders we're speaking to. But I'd like to have you on. I don't want to talk about my Apex Existentiality when I have you on mine. I want to talk about your stuff, your ideas.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, because every time I have a chance to actually talk about it, I get closer to getting
That's
clearer
how I
talking
feel.
about it.
And when you asked me to talk, I was so happy, because I mean I respect you. I've listened to you. I know you have intelligence, and you're philosophically minded, and just talking to people about my ideas, you have to have some level of understanding of philosophy and psychology and scripture even. And I can't get anywhere with hardly anybody around me. And I know so many in this project that I've seen people have expressed this frustration. I'm Intelligence is a curse. It's not. I don't know necessarily that it's a good evolutionary byproduct. I don't know if intelligence is ultimately good for humans, because
Well, I
that
mean, the part
kind of puts a
kind of a
gap, a
curse,
gulf between us.
the part that's kind of a curse the last 3 years is that once I realized that Jordan Peterson was talking about the same thing that I've been thinking about, only of course he has much more background than I do. So I got very interested in him. And then once I got interested in him, I got interested in Paul Vanderklay and John Vervaeke and all of these people. And that made me more and more and more separated out from anybody that I might have been able to talk to here, because now
Oh,
to talk to
yes.
anybody, they would have to have all of this depth of understanding of all these other
Yeah.
things that we're into. So this corner of the internet in some ways is a blessing and a curse
Yes.
in
Well,
terms of communicating.
because I have this philosophy in my head, and I have my own Apex Existentiality. So my Apex Existentiality is ideational genetic. I want the world to live out my stone heart self wants the world to live out my ideas and know it's me. And I I have grand thoughts in my head about what I have in my head, but part of me is very realistic too. So in that vein, I felt the need to study philosophy. I mean, I've been studying philosophy to some degree on and on, but the last 6 months, I I spend 3 to 4 hours a day, 2 hours a day on scripture, 1 hour a day on philosophy, and 1 hour a day on history, because I'm testing my model. I'm testing my ideas, and I'm trying to see who might. And there's been a couple of things that I thought might be revolutionary, and like, no, 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 that's not. I see where that's, but still, because of that, though, I keep diving deeper and deeper and deeper and getting more and more alienated from so many people around me. I mean, my wife doesn't. Well, my wife understands me holistically at levels that nobody else ever will. I have deep, wonderful, loving relationship with my wife, but she's never going to. I'm never going to have a detailed discussion with my wife, even about apex existentialism, because she doesn't operate in that world. She's scientific, but she's not philosophical. She's not, and e- eh, yeah, I think the people that I have in my life that I can talk to at this level is maybe two or three people at most. And
Mhm.
I think I'm probably lucky in that department, because most of the people that I hear in this project, it sounds like they don't have anyone. So at least I have a couple people to
Well,
talk to.
that's why I think it's such a blessing that even if I never get my ideas together, at least I've had an opportunity to talk to many others, and I've given others an
Yeah.
opportunity to talk. And
Yeah.
there's value in that. So
Yeah. And I'm not trying to hold on to what I have, because I want to pursue an understanding, although it's hard not to take ownership of it. Once you take ownership, it starts to become death. Then you have to find certainty where there is no certainty. And then you moving towards the stone heart apex existentiality. Then you start to will to perceive more than perceive what is. And I'm trying to perceive more what is, the reality of
and the thing
power.
I've noticed recently is that my my right hemisphere side, my more open side, that's more, you know, unfocused, or more filled with soft edges, let's say, for things to kind of catch on. That side of me has begun to shrink a little bit, because in order to verify my ideas, I have to look at physics and every aspect of science, biology, chemistry, all of those things,
Yes,
plus
I
now
have to too.
philosophy and history and all those things.
Yes.
And the more I look at those things, the more my left hemisphere has to get activated and engaged, and my right hemisphere starts to shrink.
Yeah, yeah.
So part
I
of
know
me
what you
thinks
mean.
maybe I
Yeah.
should just give up the whole pursuit.
I don't think you should. I mean, I think that I'm looking at what I'm doing as, even if I'm totally wrong, I'm going to be understanding something, and
Mhm,
and if nothing else, my pursuit, even so far, has my apex existential assumptions have helped ground me significantly
mhm.
in what I think I perceive to be much more realistic, more humane ways that are centered more towards Christ and less towards my stone heart. I've had a lot of humility come my way in the last 3 years. So yeah,
Yeah, I can resonate with that for sure. Well, this has been great, Paul. I look forward to
yeah.
get together.
All
And
right. How about 2 weeks from now, same time?
okay, sounds good to me. And
That's
in the
great. I
meantime,
love it.
let's write.
And I will, yeah, and I will also I'll contact you to figure out the time for you to come on my channel. And
Okay.
I don't have as many subs as you, but but still, I think it'd be great. And
Well,
I really want to I want to hear.
I don't have that many subs. So
Well, yeah.
263. If there's anybody out there that wants to help me out, subscribe.
Yeah, subscribe. Please like, subscribe, and share,
Yeah, I know. I guess
as they
people
say,
get
right?
tired of hearing that, but
Yeah, but yeah. Well, thank you very much. This has been really great, Karen. I enjoyed the last conversation, but this one I enjoyed more because the last one was kind of nerve-wracking because I was sharing some heavy stuff that I hadn't shared with anyone in a public setting before. So I was very nervous for that one, but this was much better for me. All right. Well,
very
thank
good.
you very much,
Okay,
and
have a great day.
God bless. We'll see you soon.